Welcome back to another visual breakdown. Today we're taking a trip back in time, right into the heart of medieval Europe and ancient trade routes. We're going to explore a historical economic phenomenon that honestly often gets clouded by a lot of mystery and misunderstanding, but we're going to look at the actual facts of history step by step using the evidence right in front of us.
So let's just address the elephant in the room and ask the main question right off the bat. If you've ever wondered why Jewish communities historically played such prominent roles in trade and finance, well, you're definitely not alone. But the real answer? There is no grand conspiracy here. Nope. It's actually a fascinating story of human survival, incredible resilience, and adapting under some truly massive external pressures.
Okay, let's dive into this. Today, we're going to walk through 5 key historical factors: forced exclusion, the origins of banking, trade networks, the weapon of education, and finally, portable wealth.
Starting with point number 1, forced exclusion in the Middle Ages.
Let's set the scene and look at this social and legal landscape in Europe back then. Imagine a world entirely run by strict feudal systems, where the laws literally dictate every single life choice you can make. These medieval laws acted as a massive push factor. You see, feudal laws completely blocked Jewish communities from owning farmland, which is basically the only real source of wealth at the time. On top of that, they were totally shut out of joining artisan guilds. So what happens when every traditional door in an agricultural economy is slammed in your face? You're backed into a corner. For these communities, the absolute only option left for survival was to pivot towards urban trade and city-based services.
Moving on to point 2, church prohibition and the origins of banking. Now, shifting gears from civil laws to the religious beliefs of the time, we find this massive economic vacuum. And the historical irony here is pretty wild. The Christian church strictly banned usury, which is lending money with interest, among Christians. But here's the catch. Medieval kings and princes were constantly fighting wars, building huge castles, and expanding their territories. They desperately needed funds for all these massively expensive projects. So, since Christians couldn't legally lend the money, rulers basically allowed and even heavily relied on the Jewish community to step in and fill this critical financial role.
The core takeaway here is that, caught between strict religious rules on one side and the endless demands of kings on the other, a historically marginalized group essentially became the unofficial Bank of Europe. It wasn't some master plan. It was just a totally unintended consequence that ended up laying the very foundations for the sophisticated European banking system we know today.
Let's move to our third point: cross-border trade networks.
So, let's shift our focus from external pressures like laws and church rules and look at internal adaptations. We've got to talk about the sheer economic power of the diaspora. Just look at this massive geographic spread. Because of historical displacement, Jewish communities formed these highly interconnected, incredibly reliable family networks that stretched all across the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. Remember, this was way before global banks, digital transfers, or internationally enforceable trade laws even existed. International trade back then relied entirely on absolute trust, and these cross-border family ties naturally provided that ultimate network of trust, making international trade and the movement of goods happen on a scale that nobody else could really match at the time.
Which brings us to point 4, the weapon of education. Now, this is where the story gets truly fascinating. When we talk about surviving and thriving, this was hands down the most powerful internal adaptation of all. Get this, in medieval Europe, the illiteracy rate was staggering. Well over 90% of the population couldn't read. I mean, even some incredibly powerful kings couldn't read or write their own names. But in stark contrast, male illiteracy within Jewish communities was sitting near 0%. Just pause and think about that for a second. The gap in basic educational baselines between them and the rest of the continent was absolutely massive.
Let's see how this builds step by step. Why was literacy so high? Well, it all started as a religious requirement. Fathers were mandated to teach their sons how to read religious texts. This created universal basic literacy. But when you can read and write in a world where virtually no one else can, that religious requirement very naturally and very quickly evolves into a massive commercial advantage. Suddenly you have an entire community that is inherently equipped to handle complex accounting, keep accurate business ledgers, and draft legally binding contracts. It was a complete game changer.
And that leads right into our final factor, point 5, portable mental wealth.
Here we arrive at a deeply ingrained psychological and economic adaptation, and it was born from a pretty painful history of displacement. Throughout history, these communities faced sudden, frequent expulsions from various countries, along with the devastating, repeated confiscation of their physical property. When you live generation after generation watching your homes, your land, and your belongings just get taken away at a moment's notice, your core economic philosophy goes through a massive shift. Real estate and physical goods, they were no longer seen as safe, stable investments. Instead, they were viewed as high-risk liabilities that could be snatched away at any second.
This created a really profound philosophy, completely driven by a survival instinct. True wealth is what you carry in your head. They realized that skills, knowledge, and expertise, think professions like medicine, law, and finance, those are the ultimate assets. They're invisible, incredibly valuable, and best of all, no one, not a medieval king and not an occupying army, can ever confiscate them from you.
Which brings us to our conclusion: investing in human capital.
Let's take a step back and look at the big picture we've just painted. The historical economic position of Jewish communities wasn't drawn up in some shadowy, secret meeting. It was the direct, inevitable result of centuries of forced focus. These were simply survival mechanisms, driven by legal exclusion, enabled by cross-border networking, and powered by an amazing accumulation of knowledge generation after generation. Ultimately, what we should all take away from this historical deep dive is a really positive, universal lesson for any society today. The absolute greatest investment you can ever make is in human capital. I'm talking about education, acquiring skills, and expanding your mind. Because as centuries of history prove to us without a shadow of a doubt, knowledge is quite literally the only asset you will ever own that nobody can take away from you. I really hope this breakdown shed some light on a fascinating piece of history for you all. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and as always, keep investing in your own learning.